The air in the Rayburn House office building always tasted the same: recycled oxygen, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of ambition. But inside the hearing room of the Committee on Oversight and Accountability, the atmosphere was heavier. It possessed a physical density, a gravitational pull that weighed on the shoulders of the men and women sitting on the elevated dais. James Comer, the chairman, sat at the center of this gravity. He didn't move. To the casual observer watching on C-SPAN, he might have looked relaxed, perhaps even bored. But that was the armor. That was the discipline. Underneath the tailored Navy suit, every muscle was coiled, locked in a state of permanent readiness. He was a man manning the ramparts of a fortress under siege, and the enemy was already inside the gates. He looked down at the mahogany surface in front of him. A stack of documents lay there. Hundreds of pages of bank records, suspicious activity reports, and flowcharts tracing the disappearance of taxpayer dollars into the abyss of fraud. Real numbers, real crimes, real consequences for the American families struggling to buy groceries while grifters in Minnesota bought luxury cars with COVID relief funds. Comer tapped his pen against the paper. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythmic, subconscious metronome counting down the seconds until the circus began. To his right, the Republicans sat in a similar state of stoic preparation. They were the adults in the room, or at least that's how they had to carry themselves. They had come here today to do the unglamorous work of forensic accounting. They wanted to talk about audits. They wanted to talk about accountability mechanisms. They wanted to know why the Biden administration had allowed billions to vanish without a trace. To his left was the theater. Comer didn't need to turn his head to know what was happening on the Democratic side of the aisle. He could feel the kinetic energy, a frantic, buzzing vibration like a hive of hornets that had just been kicked. The Democratic members were not reading documents. They were not studying the evidence of fraud. They were checking their phones. They were whispering to their press secretaries, ensuring their hair was perfect, checking the camera angles. They weren't here to legislate. They were here to clip content. They were preparing for the moment. In modern Washington, truth had become secondary to virality. If you couldn't prove your point with logic, you screamed it until the sheer volume shattered the opposition's will to argue. It was a strategy of acoustic attrition. Comer's eyes flickered toward the monitor. The red light was on. The cameras were rolling. The beast was hungry. "The chair recognizes Ms. Lee," Comer said. His voice was calm, almost dangerously low. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly what was coming and had decided, long ago, that he would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He yielded the floor not with enthusiasm, but with the resignation of a man opening a cage door, knowing the animal inside was rabid. Summer Lee, the representative from Pennsylvania, didn't just accept the recognition. She seized it. She leaned in her microphone, her body language shifting instantly from passive observer to aggressive prosecutor. From the Republican perspective, looking across that aisle was like looking into a funhouse mirror where reality was distorted. Lee represented the new guard of the Democratic Party, loud, unapologetic, and entirely uninterested in the nuances of governance. She wasn't speaking to Comer. She wasn't speaking to the witnesses. She was speaking to a very specific demographic of Twitter users who thrived on conflict. She began, not with a question, but with an indictment. "Miss Lee, the IGs are hired to identify fraud. They haven't identified fraud. The IGs have failed." Her voice cut through the hum of the HVAC system like a serrated knife. It was sharp, pitch high, with a manufactured indignation that grated on the nerves. Comer watched her, his face a mask of stone. The audacity, he thought. The sheer, unadulterated audacity. Here she was, lecturing the Oversight Committee on the failure of inspectors general, IGs. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. The Republicans knew the history. They knew that the Biden administration had systematically neutered the oversight community. They knew that when independent watchdogs started barking too loudly about waste and abuse in the trillions of dollars of spending packages, they were silenced, sidelined, or ignored. But in Lee's narrative, a narrative spun from thin air and political desperation, The lack of fraud detection wasn't because the watchdogs were muzzled. It was because the fraud didn't exist. Or worse, because the Republicans were wasting time looking for it. But anyway, Lee continued, dismissing her own premise as quickly as she had raised it. She wasn't interested in the IGs. They were just a prop. She wanted the main course. She wanted Comer. She turned her body, angling herself so that the cameras would catch her profile in a heroic light, pitting her solitary figure against the entire Republican establishment. "You all have failed," she declared. The accusation hung in the air, grotesque and heavy. On the Republican side, Representative Scott Perry stiffened. His jaw clenched. He'd spent a lifetime in service, in the military, in business, in Congress. He understood the chain of command, and he understood failure. What he was witnessing now was not oversight. It was projection. The Democrats had spent 2 years holding the House, the Senate, and the White House. And in that time, they had unleashed an inflationary firestorm and opened the border to chaos. And now, they had the gall to point the finger across the aisle? No, Lee corrected herself, ramping up the drama, realizing the first take wasn't dramatic enough for the evening news. She needed more heat. She needed more venom. "You all continue to fail." She emphasized the words like she was swinging a hammer. Bang, bang, bang. "We've done nothing." The irony was suffocating. Comer felt a dry chuckle rising in his throat, but he suppressed it. "We've done nothing?" He mused internally. "We are the only ones trying to stop the bleeding." The Republican majority had been working tirelessly to expose the rot within the federal agencies. They had subpoenaed, they had investigated, they had dragged the truth kicking and screaming into the light. But to Summer Lee, doing something meant spending more money. Doing something meant expanding the welfare state until it encompassed every aspect of American life. To her, fiscal responsibility was synonymous with doing nothing. "You've had the gavel, Mr. Chairman," she sneered. Comer looked at the gavel resting on the green felt next to his hand. It was a simple piece of wood, turned on a lathe, varnished to a shine. But in this room, it was Excalibur, and Lee hated that he held it. She loathed it. You could hear the envy dripping from every syllable. For years, the Democrats had wielded that gavel like a cudgel to beat their political opponents into submission. Now that it was in Republican hands, they couldn't stand the shift in power. They couldn't stand that they were no longer the ones writing the script. "We barely do hearings on anything that actually affects you." She spat the word "you," as if the people sitting on the Republican side were aliens. As if they weren't Americans. As if their constituents didn't bleed, didn't pay taxes, didn't suffer under the crushing weight of inflation caused by her party's policies. It was a tactic as old as Marxism itself. Dehumanize the opposition. Make them the other. Don't debate their ideas. Attack their morality. If the Republicans were concerned about fraud in Minnesota, it wasn't because they cared about the budget. No, in Lee's twisted logic, it had to be because they were villains. "You have power here, and yet you don't do anything." Her voice reached a crescendo. This was it. The clip. The money shot. She froze for a split second, eyes wide, breath heaving, waiting for the applause that wouldn't come, waiting for Comer to crack. She wanted him to yell back. She was begging for it. If Comer lost his temper, if he raised his voice even a decibel, the headlines the next morning would read, "Angry white Republican silences woman of color." The narrative was already written. All she needed was for him to play his part. But James Comer was not an amateur. He had survived the brutal trenches of Kentucky politics. He had stared down tougher opponents than a junior representative looking for a viral moment. He let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. In that silence, the power shifted. Lee's words, which had sounded so loud and formidable a moment ago, began to dissipate, revealing the hollowness inside them. Without a reaction to fuel them, her accusations just hung there, awkward and embarrassing. The room held its breath. The stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys. The aides in the back row stopped typing. Comer leaned forward slowly toward his microphone. He didn't frown. He didn't scowl. He looked at her with a calm, almost pitying expression. It was a look a teacher gives a student who has just delivered a passionate, shouting book report on a book they clearly haven't read. Yes, he actually initiated this, sir, Comer said to the clerk, addressing a procedural matter first, deliberately ignoring her outburst. It was a subtle power move, showing that the rules of the house were more important than her tantrums. Then, he turned his gaze back to her. But thank you so much for your opinion. The delivery was surgical. He didn't say, thank you for your testimony. He didn't say, thank you for your statement. He said opinion. With one word, he stripped her diatribe of any factual weight. He relegated her entire impassioned speech to the realm of subjective feeling, separating it entirely from the objective reality of the committee's work. It was a dismissal so polite, so southern, and so devastatingly cold that it likely took Lee a moment to realize she had been insulted. "You have failed," she muttered again, but the fire was gone. It was a reflex, a dying ember. She sounded petulant now, like a child who had been told to go to her room. "I yielded back," she snapped, retreating in her chair, crossing her arms. The energy in the room swirled. The Democrats looked around, unsure if they had won or lost that exchange. They had made a lot of noise, certainly, but the wall of the Republican majority remained unbreached. Comer didn't waste time celebrating the skirmish. There was work to be done. Recognizes Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes. The contrast was immediate. Scott Perry didn't leap for the microphone. He adjusted his glasses. He checked his notes. When he began to speak, the tone of the room shifted from a chaotic schoolyard back to a legislative chamber. Perry was a brigadier general in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. He knew what a fight looked like, and he knew what discipline looked like. What he had just witnessed from his colleague from Pennsylvania was a disgrace to the institution. But he wouldn't scream about it. He would dissect it. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of his Republican colleagues. There was a shared understanding there, a silent brotherhood of the sane. "I think like so many people on this committee have already articulated," Perry began, his voice steady, grounding the room back in reality. "Nobody here believes that rooting out fraud and waste and abuse is not a top priority of this committee, of our caucus, of their conference." He was offering an olive branch, or perhaps a ladder. He was giving the Democrats a chance to climb down from their pedestal of performative outrage and join the actual work of the committee. He was saying, we all agree fraud is bad, right? Can we start there? It is, if you're on this committee, it is the top charge that we all undertake incredibly seriously. Perry's words were methodical. He was laying bricks. Truth, duty, seriousness. He was building a fortress of logic to stand against the tidal wave of emotion that Lee had just unleashed. But as he spoke, Perry felt the anger simmering beneath his own calm exterior. It wasn't just that Lee was wrong. It was that she was dangerous. Her rhetoric wasn't just annoying. It was designed to paralyze the government. By framing every investigation into corruption as an attack on vulnerable populations, the Democrats were effectively creating a human shield for criminals. If you investigated a fraud ring that happened to be run by immigrants, you were xenophobic. If you investigated a fraud ring in a blue state, you were partisan. If you investigated a fraud ring involving minorities, you were racist. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed system of corruption. And the lock on that system was the word bigotry. Perry knew that Lee was just warming up. He could see it in the way the other Democrats were shifting in their seats, preparing their own talking points. They were going to play the race card. It was the only card they had left in the deck. They couldn't defend the theft of billions of dollars, so they had to attack the character of the people trying to stop it. Perry took a breath. He was about to step onto a landmine, and he knew it. But someone had to say it. Someone had to name the game that was being played. But I think like so many things with the modern Republican Party, Lee had said earlier, or implied in her tone, and now Perry was going to address the elephant in the room. He was going to address the accusation before it was even fully formed by the next speaker. The room seemed to darken slightly. The tension, which had dipped momentarily during the transition, spiked again. The silent siege was entering a new phase. The noise was over. Now came the poison. The silence that followed Summer Lee's initial outburst was not empty. It was pregnant with calculation. In the brief interlude where the gavel struck and papers were shuffled, the atmosphere in the room shifted from the sharp, sudden violence of an explosion to the suffocating heaviness of smoke. James Comer had thanked her for her opinion. It was a tactical parry, a way to compartmentalize her rage. But Summerlee was not done. She had not yet played her ace. She leaned back into the microphone. The Mr. Perry line in the official record might have been a procedural glitch, a moment where Comer attempted to pivot to the adult in the room, to Scott Perry, a man of discipline. But the energy, the sheer, overwhelming acoustic force, remained with Lee. She wouldn't let the camera cut away. She wouldn't let the narrative settle into the boring, gray rhythm of forensic accounting. She needed to change the battlefield. If the battlefield remained fraud in Minnesota, the Democrats lost. The facts were too damning. The bank records showed money meant for starving children flowing into the pockets of political cronies. There was no defense for that. So, Lee did what modern progressives always do when trapped by facts. She changed the subject to morality. I think, like so many people on this committee have already articulated, she began, her voice taking on a deceptively reasonable cadence. She was setting the trap. Nobody here believes that rooting out fraud and waste and abuse is not a top priority of this committee, of our caucus, of their conference. Their conference, on the Republican dais, the muscles in Clay Higgins' jaw tightened. Here it comes, he thought. The preamble of false equivalence. It was a standard rhetorical maneuver, claimed that everyone wants the same thing, to establish a baseline of shared humanity, only to immediately pull the rug out from under the opposition. It was the "I'm not saying, but I'm saying" tactic. She was pretending that the Democrats cared about fraud just as much as the Republicans. But if they cared, why had they spent 2 years blocking every investigation? Why had they called every subpoena a witch hunt? The Republicans sat in their leather chairs, statues of forced patience. They knew the script. They knew that when a Democrat started talking about shared priorities, it was merely the pullback of the slingshot. And then she let it fly. But I think, like so many things with the modern Republican Party, the tone shifted instantly. The reasonableness evaporated. Her eyes narrowed, fixing on the Republican side of the room, not as colleagues, but as specimens of a disease. It's like you're skulking right around the edge of things. Skulking. It was a word choice that betrayed a deep, visceral contempt. Rats skulk. Thieves skulk. In Lee's worldview, the Republicans weren't investigators shining a light in dark corners. They were predators circling a wounded animal. She was painting a picture for her audience, turning the investigators into the villains. And then came a word. The nuclear weapon of American politics. The word that was designed to stop all thought, to freeze all debate, and to mark the accused with a scarlet letter that could never be washed off. But a too often your bigotry, the Republican Party's own bigotry, is imprisoning them. Bigotry. The word landed in the center of the room like a dead bird. For a split second, the air left the lungs of the hearing room. James Comer didn't flinch. He didn't blink. But inside, a cold, hard realization settled over him. This is it, he analyzed. This is their defense. They couldn't explain why $250 million was stolen. They couldn't explain the fake invoices. So they were going to claim that investigating the theft was, in itself, an act of racism. It was a breathtaking inversion of reality. In Lee's narrative, the bigotry of the Republican Party was a prison. She described it as if the GOP were trapped by their own hatred, unable to see the good they could be doing because they were too busy being racist. Representative Byron Donalds, sitting a few seats down, felt a spike of adrenaline. As a black conservative, he had heard this slander 1,000 times. It was the intellectual laziness of the left distilled into a single sentence. To them, bigotry wasn't just a character flaw. It was a universal theory of everything. Why is there inflation? Bigotry. Why is the border open? Bigotry. Why are we investigating fraud? Bigotry. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card for corruption. Lee pressed on, sensing she had drawn blood, or at least she hoped she had, and keeping them from ever actually doing something that helps, not harms the American people. She was framing the investigation, the act of trying to recover stolen tax dollars, as harm. In her twisted logic, holding criminals accountable was harming the people. It was a philosophy of toxic compassion. We must not catch the thief because the thief might be sad. And this is another one of those instances, right? She asked rhetorically, her voice rising, preaching to the choir. When it's a person of color, if it's 2 or 3, it's a pattern. And the entire community must be indicted. Now she was in her element. She was no longer a legislator. She was a grievance archaeologist, digging up the bones of historical oppression to build a barricade around the current crime. She was explicitly arguing that the committee was only interested in this fraud because the perpetrators were Somali immigrants in Minnesota. She was suggesting that if white people had stolen the money, James Comer wouldn't care. It was a disgusting accusation. It ignored the fact that the Oversight Committee was currently investigating Hunter Biden, the whitest, most privileged man in America. It ignored the fact that they were investigating Big Pharma. It ignored the fact that fraud is colorblind. But facts didn't matter in the weaponization of victimhood. Only feelings mattered. But if it's 100 Republicans, she continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm, it's just not bad. A neither here nor there, because it's important. She was swinging wildly now, trying to draw a parallel that didn't exist, implying that Republicans forgave their own while hunting minorities. It was a projection so massive it could be seen from space. Comer watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw what she was doing. She was building a victim fortress. By wrapping the fraudsters in the flag of the marginalized, she was making them untouchable. If Comer swung his gavel now, if he demanded answers about the money, Lee would scream that he was attacking a person of color. She was using the identity of the criminals as a human shield. She is taking $250 million of theft, Comer thought, and hiding it behind the color of their skin. She's the one obsessed with race. Not us. The room felt claustrophobic. The tension was no longer professional. It was tribal. That's why we have routinely held hearings where we actually go over with the Government Accountability Office. Lee rambled, trying to pivot back to procedure to sound legitimate, but the damage was done. She had poisoned the well. But the tone of this hearing seems to be a hypocritical witch hunt. Witch hunt, the favorite phrase of the guilty. It's hard to take it as anything but that, rather than an actual oversight effort. She paused, taking a breath. The bigotry bomb had been dropped. The radiation was spreading. Now, she needed a pivot. She needed to bring in a prop to validate her reality. She turned her attention to the witness panel. Mr. Blue, she said, addressing the witness. Mr. Blue, a former federal prosecutor, sat stiffly. He was a pawn in this game, and he knew it. He had been called here to provide technical expertise, but Lee was about to use him as a ventriloquist dummy. As a former federal prosecutor, you're familiar with some of the tools that we have. Correct? Yes. Just briefly, could you please verify the following tools for me? Yes or no? This was the leading the witness phase. She didn't want his insight. She wanted his compliance. She was going to force him to agree with basic platitudes so she could weaponize them later. Does the Government Accountability Office work to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse? Yes. Do inspectors general's work towards these goals? Absolutely. It was a rhythmic chant. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. She was lulling the room into a trance of agreement. See? We all agree that systems exist. But Comer knew where this was going. She was building a syllogism. Systems exist to catch fraud. Trump hurt those systems. Therefore, Republicans are the real problem, not the Minnesota fraudsters. It was a sleight of hand, a magic trick. Look at this hand over here, Trump, so you don't notice the other hand, the stolen millions. Has the Trump administration helped to heart or hurt these tools? She asked, stumbling over her words in her eagerness to say the name. Trump. The ghost had arrived. The moment she said Trump, the energy on the Democratic side spiked. It was their drug. They couldn't function without him. He was their universal villain, their explanation for every failure, their justification for every excess. Certainly heard it by disbanding the Council for Inspectors General and then ultimately firing 19 IGs, Mr. Blue recited, playing his part perfectly. Thank you. That's right. Lee beamed. She had her soundbite. She turned back to the Republicans. armed with her new proof. Again and again, Trump has attacked the oversight mechanisms within the federal government. Comer leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim acceptance washing over him. They can't help themselves, he realized. We are here to talk about children in Minnesota not getting food. And she's talking about Donald Trump firing people 4 years ago. It was pathological, but it was also strategic. By invoking Trump, Lee was signaling to her base that this wasn't a hearing about fraud. It was a battle in the forever war against MAGA. She was trying to turn a specific, undeniable crime into a nebulous, partisan debate about oversight mechanisms. She was diluting the truth with gallons of political toxic waste. The shadow of bigotry she had cast over the room was designed to hide the shadow of corruption. And for a moment, amidst the noise and the accusations, it seemed to be working. The air in a room was now thick with the smog of racial politics, making it hard to see the simple, stark outline of the crime. But James Comer still held the gavel, and he knew that smog eventually clears. He just had to wait her out. He had to be the rock that the wave crashed against. Let her scream, he thought. Let her call us bigots. Let her summon the ghost of Trump. In the end, the bank records don't have a race. The bank records don't vote. And the bank records don't lie. But as Lee continued to rail against the hypocritical witch hunt, the Republicans couldn't help but feel the weight of the prison she was trying to build around them. A prison made of words, where any attempt to enforce the law was branded as an act of hate. It was a silent siege, and the walls were closing in. The name Trump hung in the air like smoke from a flare gun, signaling the troops to rally. Summer Lee had fired it, and now she was basking in the afterglow. To the Republicans on the dais, it was a moment of profound, exhausting predictability. It was the Godwin's Law of the 118th Congress. As the probability of a Democrat losing an argument about policy approaches one, the probability of them mentioning Donald Trump becomes absolute. James Comer watched her with eyes that had seen too much. He didn't interrupt. He didn't bang the gavel. He knew that to interrupt her now would be to give her exactly what she wanted, a clip of a white man silencing her. So he let her speak. He let her construct her alternative reality brick by brick. Again and again, Trump has attacked the oversight mechanisms within the federal government. Lee intoned, reading from her notes with the fervor of a prosecutor closing a murder case. He illegally fires 17 inspectors, a general, and other key personnel. He goes after whistleblowers, and he tries to roll back their protections. On the other side of the aisle, Scott Perry adjusted his glasses. The lens caught the overhead light, obscuring his eyes for a brief flash. Inside his mind, the rational man, the soldier, the patriot, was dissecting her argument with surgical precision. She is comparing personnel decisions, Perry thought, with criminal theft. It was a staggering false equivalence. Donald Trump firing an inspector general, a political appointee who serves at the pleasure of the president, was a constitutional exercise of executive power. Whether you liked it or not, it was legal. It was policy. But what happened in Minnesota? What happened with the Feeding Our Future scandal? That wasn't policy. That was larceny. That was people creating fake lists of children who didn't exist, to siphon off $250 million in taxpayer funds to buy Porsches, jewelry, and coastal real estate. And yet, here was Summer Lee, looking the American people in the eye and telling them that the real crime wasn't the theft of their money. It was the firing of a bureaucrat 4 years ago. He routinely ignores the rampant corruption within his own administration, she continued, stumbling slightly over the word rampant, her cadence fueled more by adrenaline than accuracy. Republicans have turned a blind eye to all of this. They have held no hearings on these actions. Because we were looking at the checkbook, Comer thought grimly. We were looking at the bank accounts. The difference between the two parties had never been starker. The Democrats were obsessed with process crimes, who got fired, who said what, who followed which protocol. The Republicans were obsessed with actual crimes. Where did the money go? Lee was building a fog machine. She was pumping so much smoke into the room that she hoped no one would notice the fire burning in the kitchen. And then, finally, she pivoted back to the actual subject of the hearing, but only to dismiss it. And this hearing today isn't even about fraud generally within the federal benefit system, which we would welcome. Lie, Perry noted silently. We've tried to hold hearings on general fraud. You call those racist too? Republicans have cherry-picked a blue state and an immigrant population vulnerable to demonize. Demonize? There it was again. The victimhood shield. Lee was arguing that investigating a crime in a blue state was an act of partisan aggression. She was suggesting that Minnesota should be exempt from scrutiny because it voted Democrat. It was a feudal mindset. This is our territory. You have no right to look inside our castle. And the immigrant population line was even more insidious. The fraudsters in Minnesota happened to be Somali immigrants. That was a fact. It wasn't a Republican invention. It was on the indictments. But Lee was twisting that fact into a weapon. She was implying that Republicans chose to investigate them because of their origin, not because of their crime. She was erasing the agency of the criminals. In her world, the fraudsters weren't responsible adults who made a choice to steal. They were helpless, vulnerable populations being bullied by the mean Republicans. It was the soft bigotry of low expectations, assuming that immigrants couldn't possibly be held to the same moral standard as everyone else. To be clear, Minnesota is not the only state with a fraud problem, she conceded quickly, a throwaway line to cover her bases. To truly tackle waste, fraud, and abuse, we need to approach the issue with a scalpel, not a mallet. The scalpel versus the mallet. Comer almost smiled at the metaphor. It was perfect. It perfectly encapsulated the weakness of the modern democratic approach to governance. When you find a cancerous tumor, a $250 million tumor, you don't tickle it with a scalpel. You don't try to massage it. You cut it out. You use force. You shut down the funding stream immediately until you can figure out what the hell is going on. But Lee didn't want to stop the flow of money. That was the one thing she feared more than fraud, acutely cutting spending. Discovering that people are committing fraud in the federal program does not mean we should smash the whole thing and end it, she pleaded. Perry realized. There it is. The truth. She was terrified that if the American people saw the scale of the waste, they would demand the program be ended. She wasn't fighting for the poor. She was fighting for the program. The program was the god. The program provided the jobs for the bureaucrats, the contracts for the NGOs, the votes for the party. The program had to be protected at all costs, even if it was leaking money like a sieve. It means its oversight mechanisms need to be improved, she said weakly. Improved? Comer thought. You want to improve the oversight mechanisms by giving them more money to oversee the money they already lost? It was the logic of a hoarder. The house is messy. Let's buy more stuff to organize the mess. That's why it's so disappointing to see that the Minnesota House Fraud Prevention Committee that our witness, the Honorable Kristen Robbins chairs, has issued no reports on these uncovered schemes. She turned her fire on the witness, Kristen Robbins, a Republican from the Minnesota State Legislature. Robbins sat quietly, her hands folded. She had come here to testify about how her state's government, controlled by Democrats, had failed to stop the theft. And now, she was being blamed for not writing enough reports about it. It was classic deflection. Don't blame the arsonist. Blame the fireman for not writing a poetic enough description of the fire. It hasn't advanced any legislation to address the issue or even shared whistleblower reports with their Democratic colleagues. Lee was flailing now. She was throwing procedural complaints at a wall of criminal reality. She was complaining about paperwork while the Republicans were talking about felonies. They've just held a bunch of hearings and generated headlines, something our committee is all too familiar with. The irony was palpable. Summer Lee, the woman who was currently screaming, waving her hands, and performing for TikTok, was accusing the Republicans of generating headlines. James Comer looked at the clock. Her time was running down. The storm was passing. But the wreckage she left behind was significant. She had successfully muddied the waters. She had introduced the racial element. She had invoked Trump. She had turned a hearing about accounting into a hearing about identity. But she had also revealed her hand. She had admitted that fraud existed. She just didn't think it was a big enough deal to stop the money train. This hearing is not an effort by Republicans to improve social service programs, she declared, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's an excuse to end them and to punish democratic states. Punish. That was the worldview of the victim. Everything was a punishment. Accountability was punishment. Audits were punishment. Laws were punishment. To the rational man, to Scott Perry, to James Comer, to the millions of Americans who balance their checkbooks every month, it wasn't punishment. It was consequences. If you give your teenager a credit card and he spends $5,000 on video games, taking the card away isn't punishing him for being young. It's stopping him from bankrupting the family. But Lee couldn't see that, or she refused to see it. This has always been the plan, she said, unveiling the grand conspiracy. The plan, as if the Republicans sat in a dark room, smoking cigars, plotting ways to starve children. It was a cartoon villain fantasy that played well on MSNBC, but crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. Comer watched her, his face a mask of weary endurance. He knew what was coming next. She was going to list the cuts. She was going to throw out terrifying numbers. Millions of people losing benefits, trillions of dollars slashed. She was going to paint a picture of an apocalyptic wasteland caused by Republican thrift. It was the fear-mongering phase. And as she wound up for the pitch, Comer prepared himself. He tightened his grip on the gavel. The noise was loud, yes. The accusations were vile, yes. But in the silence of his own mind, he held on to one simple truth. Math doesn't care about your feelings, Ms. Lee. The numbers on the page in front of him hadn't changed. $250 million was still gone, and no amount of screaming about Trump was going to bring it back. The rational man waited. The storm raged on. The hearing room was no longer a place of inquiry. It had become a pulpit. Summer Lee was preaching the gospel of the Leviathan state, and in her theology, any attempt to trim the fat of the beast was a mortal sin. It's an excuse to end them and to punish democratic states. This has always been the plan. James Comer sat motionless, his eyes fixed on a point just past Lee's left shoulder. He was listening to a conspiracy theory being woven in real time. The plan, the way she said it, with that breathless mix of certainty and dread, suggested a cabal of Republicans sitting in a smoke-filled room, cackling as they snatched bread from the mouths of orphans. It was a caricature so broad it belonged in a Saturday morning cartoon. But Comer knew the danger of it. It was the big lie of the welfare state. If you don't let us waste billions, you hate the poor. It's why Republicans' so-called Big Beautiful Bill is estimated to cut more than $1 trillion from Medicaid and CHIP benefits and cut SNAP for 40 million people. She threw the numbers around like confetti. 1 trillion, 40 million. Representative Andy Biggs, sitting on the far end of the dais, scribbled a note on his legal pad. Unfunded liabilities. To the Democrats, cutting meant reducing the rate of growth of a program that was already bankrupting the nation. To the Republicans, it was saving. It was the difference between a doctor amputating a gangrenous limb to save the patient and a spectator screaming that the doctor is a butcher. Lee's voice trembled with rehearsed empathy. The very children or folks with disabilities who were mentioned in the opening statements. She was using human shields again. She was holding up the disabled and the children to block the artillery fire of the audit. Don't look at the fraudsters buying Lamborghinis, she was saying. Look at this sad child. If you stop the fraudsters, you hurt the child. It was a hostage situation. Give us the money without oversight, or the kid gets it. And then, having established the moral depravity of her opponents, she identified the enemy's intelligence network. Trump has also already taken advantage of the situation in Minnesota. Taken advantage, as if noticing a crime was an act of opportunism. After a YouTuber harassed and posted unsubstantiated claims of fraud against child care centers. A YouTuber, the phrase hung in the air, dripping with establishment disdain. Scott Perry's head snapped up. This was a new front in the war. She wasn't just attacking the committee anymore. She was attacking the First Amendment. She was attacking the democratization of information. The YouTuber she was sneering at was likely a citizen journalist. One of the few people who had actually gone to the sites in Minnesota, who had filmed the empty parking lots, who had done the work that the mainstream media refused to do. To Summer Lee and the Democratic machine, an independent citizen with a camera and a question was not a whistleblower. They were a harasser. They were illegitimate. They didn't have a press pass from the New York Times. They didn't have the blessing of the DNC. Therefore, their truth was unsubstantiated claims. It was a glimpse into the soul of the modern left. They feared the uncontrolled flow of information. They feared the citizen who refused to be spoon-fed the official narrative. HHS froze childcare funding to Minnesota, which would affect more than 23,000 children. She said it as if it were a tragedy. HHS froze funding. Good. Comer screamed internally. That's what you do when you find a theft ring. You stop the money. If a bank notices suspicious activity on your credit card, they freeze the card. They don't say, well, we don't want to inconvenience you, so we'll let the thief buy a few more TVs while we figure this out. But in Lee's world, the flow of government cash was sacred. Interrupting it, even to stop a crime, was the real crime. The logic was inverted. The freezing of funds wasn't the consequence of the fraud. In her retelling, it was an act of aggression by Trump and a harassing YouTuber. Just yesterday, Trump also froze approximately $10 billion in funding for programs supporting childcare, social services, grants, and cash assistance. $10 billion. The number echoed in the high ceilings of the room. To the Republicans, that number represented $10 billion of hard-earned wages stripped from plumbers, truck drivers, and waitresses in their districts. It was $10 billion that wouldn't fuel inflation. It was $10 billion saved. To Lee, it was $10 billion of power lost. And not only Minnesota, but in other Democratic-led states of California, Colorado, New York, and Illinois. She rattled off the list of blue states like a roll call of victims. But looking at the map, Comer saw something else. These were the sanctuary states. These were the high-tax, high-regulation states that were bleeding population. These were the states where the fraud tax was built into the cost of doing business. She was framing this as a partisan attack, Republicans attacking Democrats. But the reality was far simpler. Accountability attacking profligacy. The ghost of Trump was now fully materialized in the room. Lee was no longer debating James Comer. She was shadowboxing with the former president. She was signaling to the cameras, see, the bad orange man is back, and he's coming for your EBT card. It was fear-mongering distilled to its purest essence. It was designed to bypass the frontal cortex of the voter and strike directly at the amygdala. Panic, fear, vote blue, and then the pivot, the tonal shift that was so jarring it almost caused whiplash. No matter what party we're elected to, we represent the people of our district, Democrat or Republican. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. For 4 minutes and 50 seconds, she had called the Republicans bigots, failures, conspirators, punishers, and threats to children. She had demonized their motives, mocked their efforts, and dismissed their concerns as racism. And now she wanted to wrap herself in the flag of unity. We represent, as the federal government, all people of all states, irrespective of how they voted. Scott Perry rubbed his temples. The headache was setting in. It was the specific kind of headache induced by watching someone arson a building and then lecture the fire department on the importance of community safety. You don't represent my constituents, Perry thought. My constituents want the border closed. My constituents want prices to go down. My constituents want to know why they are working overtime to pay for fraud in Minnesota. That's the charge that I took, and I would like and hope that you all would do the same. She looked down her nose at them, a schoolmarm scolding unruly pupils. She was claiming the moral high ground after spending 5 minutes in the gutter of partisan slurs. When so many of these social service programs are being gutted and defunded, fraud becomes even more harmful, as that means even less money is going to people who need it. Finally, Comer thought. She stumbled onto the truth by accident. Yes, fraud is harmful. Yes, it takes money away from the needy. That was the entire point of the Republican investigation. That was why they were here. But Lee couldn't stay there. She couldn't admit that the Republicans were right to be angry. People need these programs. It was the ultimate trump card. Need justified everything. Need justified the lack of oversight. Need justified the fraud. Need justified the silence. This situation should be an opportunity to take a deep look at the programs and improve their oversight abilities, not an excuse to cut them entirely. Improve oversight abilities. Translated from bureaucrat speak, that meant hire more Democrats. It meant creating a new Office of Fraud Prevention with a budget of $50 million, staffed by the cousins of the people who committed the fraud in the first place. It was the self-licking ice cream cone of government failure. If we care about the most vulnerable, if we care about the most marginalized, this is an opportunity to do so. And I welcome us to actually do that one day. She emphasized one day with a weary sigh, implying that day would never come as long as the evil Republicans held the gavel. Thanks. I yield back. She finished. The storm abated. The silence rushed back into the room, filling the void left by her voice. Summer Lee sat back, arranging her papers, looking satisfied. She had delivered the sermon. She had fed the base. She had protected the narrative. But on the dais, James Comer didn't move. He didn't look impressed. He looked like a man who had just watched a magician perform a trick he knew the secret to. She thinks she won, Comer thought, his hand resting on the handle of the gavel. She thinks noise is victory. But outside this room, in the Real America, people were checking their bank accounts. They were looking at the price of eggs. They were reading the headlines about the Minnesota fraud. The real headlines, not the ones sanitized by Lee's rhetoric. The YouTuber she despised was probably uploading a video right now, dissecting her lies frame by frame. The Trump she feared was probably drafting a statement. The walls of the victim fortress were high, yes, but they were made of paper. And James Comer was holding a match. He leaned forward to the microphone. The rational man was about to speak again. The theater was over. The audit would continue. The red light on the camera blinked. On, off, on, off, like a mechanical heartbeat, indifferent to the passions it recorded. Summer Lee had finished. The last syllable of her yield back still seemed to vibrate in the recycled air of the Rayburn building, a phantom echo of a battle that had been fought entirely on one side. She sat back, her chest rising and falling, adrenaline still flooding her system. She looked around, perhaps expecting a reaction, a gasp, an applause, a rebuttal, something to validate the emotional expenditure she had just poured out. But she received nothing. The Republican side of the dais was a wall. It was a cliff face against which waves crashed and dissipated, leaving the stone wet but unmoved. James Comer did not look at her. He did not sigh. He did not roll his eyes. He simply continued. In the genre of political theater, this was the most devastating critique possible. If he had argued, he would have elevated her rant to the level of debate. If he had yelled, he would have dragged himself down to the level of a brawl. But by ignoring it, by treating her apocalyptic warnings and accusations of bigotry as nothing more than a scheduled interruption, like a commercial break, he stripped them of their power. He looked down at his notes. The paper crinkled slightly under his fingertips. The sound was small, crisp, and incredibly grounding. The chair recognizes. Comer began. His voice was unchanged. It had the same Kentucky drawl, the same steady cadence that it had an hour ago. It was the voice of a man who had a job to do, and who understood that his job was not to be a character in Summer Lee's movie. To the Republicans in the room, to Scott Perry, to Andy Biggs, to the staffers lining the back wall, this moment was the victory. It wasn't a victory of shouting. It was the victory of persistence. They realized, sitting there in the aftermath of the storm, that the modern Democratic strategy relied entirely on exhaustion. They wanted to scream so loud, accuse so viciously, and distort reality so thoroughly that the opposition would simply give up. They wanted the Republicans to say, "Fine, keep the money, keep the fraud, just stop calling us racists." But looking at Comer, looking at Perry, looking at the witness panel that had endured the insults with quiet dignity, it was clear they were not tired. In fact, the outburst had only clarified their purpose. Comer glanced briefly at the witness, Mr. Blue, and then at Kristen Robbins. He saw the fatigue in their eyes, the weariness of normal people dragged into the vortex of Washington insanity. He offered them a subtle nod. A silent communication. We know. We see it too. Hold the line. The hearing moved on. The rational man resumed control. Questions were asked about specific invoices. Clarifications were sought regarding the timeline of the FBI raid. The boring, granular, necessary details of forensic accounting filled the air, replacing the ozone smell of ideology with the dry dust of facts. But inside James Comer's mind, the deeper narrative was writing its final chapter for the day. He thought about the voters back home. He thought about the farmers in Monroe County, the small business owners in Paducah. If they were watching this, and God, he hoped they were, what did they see? Did they see a powerful woman of color speaking truth to power, as the MSNBC cheering would undoubtedly read tonight? Or did they see a person in a position of immense responsibility acting like a teenager denied a credit card? Comer bet on the latter. He bet on the common sense of the American people. He believed, perhaps naively, perhaps stubbornly, that eventually the noise stops working. Eventually, you can't eat anti-racism. Eventually, you can't heat your home with social justice. Eventually, the math comes for everyone. The bigotry accusation was a prison, Lee had said. But staring across the aisle at the chaotic energy of the Democrats, Comer realized the truth was the opposite. The Republicans weren't the ones in prison. They were the ones holding the keys to the only thing that could liberate the country: accountability. The Democrats were the ones trapped. They were trapped in a mental prison where every critique was an attack, every audit was a hate crime, and every dollar saved was a tragedy. They were prisoners of their own narrative, forced to defend the indefensible, to defend theft, because admitting they were wrong would mean the collapse of their entire worldview. It was a tragedy, really. Summer Lee wasn't the villain. She was a symptom. She was the product of a system that rewarded performance over competence, feelings over facts, and loyalty over logic. The gavel felt heavy in Comer's hand, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of the institution. He looked up at the clock on the wall. The time was ticking away. The hearing would end soon. The cameras would turn off. The reporters would rush to the hallway to ask Lee about her viral moment. She would give interviews. She would raise money off this clip. She would be celebrated at cocktail parties in Georgetown. But the fraud would still be there. The bank records would still be in the safe. And tomorrow, James Comer would come back. Scott Perry would come back. The staff would come back. They would sit in these same chairs. They would drink the same stale coffee. They would open the same binders. And they would keep counting. Because that is what adults do. They don't scream. They don't cry. They don't play the victim. They do the work. As the hearing wound down, the room began to feel different. The arena of noise had been reclaimed. It was once again a place of business. The shadows that Summer Lee had cast, the shadows of bigotry, of Trump, of fear, had retreated into the corners, chased away by the steady, unglamorous light of procedure. Comer leaned into the mic for the final time that segment. We will now move to the next witness. It was a mundane sentence, but in the context of the last hour, it was a declaration of war. It said, "You cannot stop us. You can scream at the rain, but you cannot stop the river." The camera pulled back, showing the wide shot of the room. On the left, the restless energy of the Democrats, checking phones, whispering, already moving on to the next outrage. On the right, the stillness of the Republicans, heads down, writing, working. Two Americas in one room. One loud, one quiet. One performing, one governing. The screen faded to black, but the sound of the gavel striking the wood, crack, echoed into the silence, a final punctuation mark that said more than 1,000 words ever could. The siege was over. The fortress stood.